This video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. Check out Surfshark VPN at surfshark.deal/Kraut. Surfshark VPN is the VPN that I use when browsing the internet, mostly for its really handy Chrome extension. You can also use an app version, which you can use across many devices across a whole range of platforms, and you can use Surfshark across many devices with only one subscription. There's a strict no-logs policy, so nobody can track anything you do online, and my preferred use of Surfshark is to access foreign media that is inaccessible in my country, such as Netflix shows and other programs that are nationally restricted and are only available in foreign countries. Go to surfshark.deal/Kraut or use the link in the description below and use the code KRAUT to get 83% off a 2-year plan and 3 months for free. Thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring this video, and now let's get into it.
This is the story of a popular misconception and falsehood. When humans first formed societies, these tended to be mostly primogeniture tribal structures that were bound together under the norms and customs of the group. You will still find these forms of organization enduring throughout many modern societies as well, be it the Chinese Confucian family or the tribal hierarchies of Arabia. However, you will not find it anymore in Europe, as well as North and South America. Which brings up an important question. What broke the European tribal family? Historians such as Peter Laslett in Household and Family in Past Time and Richard Wall in Family Forms of Historic Europe argued that this dynasticism existed in Europe up until the 19th century, when these structures were destroyed by the Industrial Revolution. That destruction created large urban centers for former farm laborers and craftsmen, which tore generational bonds apart. The basis of this claim is the Modernization Theory of the 19th century, formulated by people such as Weber Engels and Max Weber. Weber claimed that modernity had shattered kinship, religious restraints, and social norms, to replace them with individualistic and egalitarian state systems established in rational law and under a market orientation, in contrast to a medieval society with regulated markets and price controls by the priesthood. Marx and Engels claimed that the bourgeoisie that developed out of industrialization
has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and reduced family to a mere monetary relation.
In the earliest Marxist view, the modernization of the means of production destroyed the tribal society. The smaller nuclear family of Christianity, based on partnerships rather than clans and communities, was a result of economic forces. A part of the transition of the socio-economic configuration of society from feudalism to capitalism, as a part of a wider evolution eventually leading into communism. There is, however, a problem. Engels was wrong, and Weber was also wrong. Engels, however, was more wrong than Weber. His idea that feudalism is an economic structure and that societies evolve from different stages to others due to economic and class forces is a very popular one that is still widely repeated by Marxists today. But decades of research by historians and anthropologists after Marx have conclusively shown that European kinship structures disappeared centuries before the Industrial Revolution. The number of marriages and birth rates have been consistently lower in Western Europe compared to Eastern Europe and even the wider world. The number of women in the workforce and the number of women who acquired property and married late has also been consistently higher in Western Europe compared to everywhere else. All of this since the 1400s. English women had the right to own, buy, and sell land as property, own and sell chattel, work for themselves, sue or be sued, all without the need of approval by a male guardian since 1066. Meaning these standards that disrupted kinship structures of Anglo-Saxon England may have been imported to England by the Normans from medieval France and existed almost a millennia before the Industrial Revolution. By the early 1500s, the right of individuals to disinherit their children or to freely leave their land was firmly established within English common law. Additionally, the ability to privately own property as a possession indefinitely had been well established by the 1100s. People in 1400s England were also already freely trading and selling property without the need of approval by an aristocrat. By the 1300s, we find contracts of care and labor between parents and their children in medieval England, in which children would be contractually obliged to care for them at old age. We find that parents who foolishly signed over their property to their children without such contracts sometimes found themselves evicted, destitute, poor, or mistreated by their children. These are important facts because, number one, in tribal societies shaped and governed by familial ascendancy, people are tied to the land they live in through their ancestors being buried on that land, and many other communal obligations. Land was often held in common in that it was shared by a network of related family units. Just selling land is not possible in a kinship society. Number two, children within tribal societies have strict duties to care and respect their parents and elders. Number three, women within kinship societies only ever gain legal rights and social value through their ability to marry and continue a patrimonial lineage by giving birth to an heir. Women who are part of the workforce to earn for themselves, marry late, or let alone own property that they can sell outside of the group, do not exist in this form of social organization. The claim that industrialization and the advent of capitalism destroyed the family and turned it into a mere mechanism of acquiring capital is factually false. A false claim that is part of an entire theory of history on social development through class forces. Yet, we know today that the practice of dumping your aging parents in a retirement home to get rid of them is not a capitalist practice born from industrialization, but a practice that in some shape or form dates back to medieval Europe. The advent of capitalism through industrialization did not destroy kinship. One can argue, in fact, that it was the other way around, and that capitalism is a result of the destruction of kinship. Engels, Marx, and by that extent the Marxists, misunderstood feudal medieval Europe. They relied for their theories on the theories of the people who first described feudalism, those who had led the French Revolution. And it was their intention to destroy absolutism. To them, the idea of feudalism seemed inseparable from the French nobility that they sought to destroy. Rousseau, for example, could have seen political utility in his picture of early human history. He described the state of nature of mankind, an hypothetical era before social organization, as harmonious communities based on fraternity and moral intuition, where everyone lived in an idealized freedom. Then, civilization compelled these free peoples into increasingly coercive social contracts that made them miserable and alienated. This was a jab at the monarchs of Europe and the Catholic Church, as in Rousseau's view, it was these two who were the great corruptors of mankind, rather than the saviors that they presented themselves as. In their efforts, they made a mistake that Marx and Engels would later repeat, describing the past through the lens of their own interests in the present. It's not hard to see how Rousseau's state of nature runs parallel to Marx's primitive communism, an imagined past where humans lived in classless, egalitarian, hunter-gatherer societies. And it is wrong. As we've discussed, there was nothing classless about tribal societies, as someone's place in a lineage and the particular customs of a tribe determined almost every aspect of their life. What even is feudalism, and where did it come from? What we find when we look at the nobility of the feudal era is that many of them didn't have large bloodlines. The oldest noble family of Europe are the Bourbons, who were kings of France and are the current kings of Spain. However, their ancestry traces back merely to the year 866 to an obscure Robert the Strong. European noble families are able to trace ancestry up to a certain point, but when we reach the year 800, that ancestral line deludes into the unknown. So, where were they before 800? Curiously, the stories of early medieval Icelandic peasants, passed down in oral tradition, are better known to us than the ancestry of the European medieval feudal lords. And this is important because it breaks with a distinctively Roman and Hellenic tradition of dynasticism. Roman society was in many ways built on and around the extensive lineages of the aristocratic families that governed Rome. Such lineages, however, did not exist in feudal Europe, thereby clearly separating it. Additionally, feudal European nobility often traced their ancestry through mothers, something that kinship societies almost universally do not do. We also find that in feudal societies, mothers even gave their children their surnames, a privilege not granted to mothers in kinship societies, because primogeniture is standard. By the 1300s, the small Christian nuclear family that we know today, and which Engels and Weber claim to have been created in the 1800s, disconnected from clans, feuds, and tribal norms, had already been well established throughout large parts of Europe. So, what happened between 1300 and the end of the Roman Empire? Muslims, Vikings, Hungarians, and God.
According to the French historian Marc Bloch and his extensive research into feudal social structures of medieval Europe, European feudalism evolved as a reaction to the collapse of the Carolingian social order and was preconditioned by the advent of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Marxists and historical materialists in general have a very straightforward view of religion. Marx famously referred to it as the opioid of the people, a simple mechanism to keep the oppressed by those classes that control the economic institutions, a superstructure that post hoc justifies the infrastructure. However, this analysis is incredibly self-limiting and flawed. It ignores important historical developments, which consequently have led many a Marxist to many wrong conclusions. Because belief and religion in general as a mechanism of organizing a society is one of the main and most important tools and functions by which the first societies came to be. The frigid historical materialism of Marxism in pursuit of justifying its objectives in the present tends to overlook the importance of religion. For the peoples of the late antiquity and early Middle Ages, religion was less a matter of belief as it was a relationship with reality. Evolving out of tribal ancestor worship, religions provided a strong foundation for societies to structure and build a social order. And within the system of religious social orders, Abrahamic religions were somewhat of a revolution. They directly challenged the social order of kinship societies by affirming that all human beings have a spark of divinity. Fundamentally the same spark of divinity, and that idea leads to direct conflict with families that claimed ancestry from gods and consequently enforced a social order in which some are spiritually and consequently socially superior. Early Christianity took an especially strong stance against the marriage of relatives, the marriage of widows, adoption, and divorce, practices that were widespread and essential to the functioning of a tribal family structure and tribal society. After adopting Christianity as its state religion, Rome and later societies had their family dynasties, which were based on tribal kinship structures, become ever more undermined and eventually disbanded. Long family lineages that were so important throughout the previous centuries of Roman rule were increasingly left behind and didn't matter much at all at its collapse. Many of these changes to society were reinforced by the emerging Catholic Church, who, for example, specifically condemned pagans such as the Anglo-Saxons for engaging in incestuous cousin marriages. These condemnations weren't only a matter of destitution and accusations. The Franks were notorious for engaging in holy wars, from the expulsion of Muslims in Iberia to the many attacks against Germanic tribes east of the Rhine. To the historical materialist, armed conflict with the sole motivation of converting pagans sounds cartoonish, because it should have an economic incentive crawling from beneath the rug. But this is exactly what happened. Feudal economies, powered primarily by agricultural modes of production, have basically no gains to make from campaigning in the mountains of Scandinavia, the Middle Eastern deserts, the swamps of Ireland, the dry hills of Spain, the marshes of the Baltic, or the Alps. Yet, missionaries and armies went into these regions with the patronage of kings. Religion was not a mere mechanism of power to enforce an economic order. Religion in feudal society was a driving political force in itself. This tells us a lot about the raison d'être behind feudal states. But what was the founding force that established and formed feudalism in the first place? How was feudalism even created? What helped create and cement the feudal social order the most was war. The aforementioned Muslims, Vikings, and Hungarians. Europe, after the decline and later collapse of the Roman Empire, spent centuries being sacked and raided by Muslim invaders from the south, Hungarian warbands from the east, and by Viking plunderers from the north. It was in this climate of quite literal physical insecurity that feudalism was born, not as an economic order, but as a contract of voluntary submission to a warlord in order to access the protection of his castle. People unable to rely on tribal clans for defense after those had been eroded by Christianity submitted themselves to a new aristocracy of Germanic warrior chiefs for safety. This is why European aristocratic lineages only go back to the year 800. Feudalism, feudal lords, and the European aristocracy in general were born out of the most effective leaders that emerged from the bloodshed and chaos of the time period we Europeans call the Dark Ages. And the glue that held it all together was Christianity. Emperor Constantine exempted the Christian Church of the Roman Empire from taxation. This was justified in the assumption that they relieved the state of some of its functions. With this, the higher offices of the clergy became able to exercise authority over economically active territories. Think about that for a second. There was a parastatal organization spread throughout Europe that was influential and partially in charge of some of the functions of government, and they weren't a clan or a state, but an association bound by a code and a creed. With overall short life expectancies, the inability of landlords to pass on land down bloodlines as an inheritance, the Latin Church grew in power, as land without heirs often became its property. Latin Christianity, as opposed to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, became an increasingly independent, self-sustained entity with moral authority over states. The warlords would bicker and fight each other over land, resources, and influence. We could argue that the basic principles of these rivalries morphed and continued to shape the nature of European war deep into the 20th century, but at least for over 1,000 years, the warrior chiefs and later kings of Europe would legitimize themselves by subordinating themselves to the god of their peasants. The papacy started to preside and wag its finger over kings as the base of their legitimacy, as they capitalized on being in good standing with the institution of Christianity embodied in the Catholic Church. Pepin the Younger, the founder of the Carolingian dynasty, conquered significant swathes of Italy and gifted them to the Pope as a sign of piety. This was the founding moment of the Papal States, and it turned the Catholic priesthood from its seat in Rome into an even more empowered entity. They became a land-owning institution without dynastic heredity of their power and capital, almost aristocrats without an actual aristocracy, but rather managed within a hierarchy of piety, which now was a government. The aforementioned ownership of property by women is an accidental side effect of these church laws. As property could only be passed down direct heirs, widows ended up owning property, and a legal framework for women to own property was consequently created out of necessity. Tribal Europe of kinship with large families was largely gone by the year 1000. The Germanic, Nordic, Hungarian, and Slavic tribal structures all fell within a few generations of their people's conversion to Christianity. The tribal family died, and the nuclear family replaced it. This is cemented by the fact that this development into feudalism did not take place in far-flung, isolated places unaffected by the Dark Ages, such as the Scottish Highlands or the Albanian mountains. Institutions such as serfdom were not introduced there until they were imported by invading foreign aristocracies, but also in places where Latin Christianity never took a lasting hold, like Greece. Consequently, paternalistic tribal family structures continue in these places. If you ever dated a Greek, you probably know what I am talking about. One does not simply date a Greek, it is more like a social contract within a communal corporation governed by around 20 or so cousins. This is because Greece, which by and large remained outside of the influence of Western Christianity, has not extensively adopted the social structure of the nuclear family, and the sort of light kinship structure consequently still persists to this day. The nuclear family and the groundwork for what some call individualism had already been laid by the 11th century. In other societies, such as China, agnatic family groups had never even been disbanded. Consequently, modernizations and reforms in political and economic institutions always had to fight opposition coming from entrenched kinship groups and their social structures. In contrast, when banking and commerce emerged in 15th century Venice and in 16th century Amsterdam, it could do so without having to contest with the interests of entrenched tribal dynastics swaying wider society. The lack of a state religion in China also meant that it could centralize it into a unified bureaucratic state earlier than other societies. But China also did not develop a concept of rule of law, in which the law is an impartial arbiter of justice. Law developed in China merely as a mechanism and tool for rulers to enact order. It is more of a rule by law rather than a rule of law. While in the Middle East and Europe, through Christianity and Islam, law developed through religious institutions as an impartial arbiter of justice for all, a development leading to a concept of law as a mechanism of accountability for rulers, rather than just the tools of rulers. It is very doubtful that this was the intention of these religious institutions. One can consequently argue that Christian, Islamic, or Abrahamic religions in general are, as a political institution, inherently self-destructive, since the social forces they unleash through the destruction of kinship and tribal structures eventually undermine their own political power. Abrahamic religions are unable to control the social forces they unleash. However you may interpret it, it is in the end self-limiting to just ignore these developments, or just naively write them off as a mere mechanism in service of materialistic goals. What we learn here is, like Marc Bloch wrote in Feudal Society, that to view history from the self-limiting lens of defining and trying to find a homo economicus, a homo philosophicus, or a homo juridicus is an endeavor bound to failure. Economic structures, philosophies, and laws are only partial structures, or part of a society, but never represent a society at large. One should also avoid foisting one's own modern lenses upon a society of the past. To have a best possible image of what a society is, and how and where it developed, one must be able to embrace a society for what it was during its time, as a living and breathing structure. The self-limiting Marxist notions that kinship was destroyed by 19th century industrialization and that the nuclear family is a capitalistic product of the 19th century unfortunately still persists. The reality, as you saw, is very different. It was not mechanisms of capital that created the feudal society in the first place. Neither was it mechanisms of capital that destroyed European tribalism. It was Christianity, furthered by the instability caused by Hungarian, Viking, and Muslim invaders of the 6th to 8th century. Hey, so this video was a collaboration with my friend Ravignon. Once every few months, I'm going to, from now on, pick a smaller YouTuber who I really like, go through a list of topics together with them, let them pick one of the topics that interests both of us, and work together on it. Both me and Ravignon did the research, writing, and editing of this video. Ravignon is a French-Mexican, or is it Mexican-French? Well, Mexican and French, he's both of those. YouTuber who has an interest in political and social development. He makes videos analyzing political developments throughout history to map out how specific political and economic structures came to be. On his channel, you will find, for example, a very long series of videos that are part of a series about the history of Quebec. In this series, he showcases and explains the unique political development of Quebec and how the social and economic forces of the French-speaking Quebecois shaped very unique political structures and impacted Canada at large. He will be making more videos like these in the future, and I am very eager to use my platform to promote him. I am therefore going to leave links to Ravignon's channel, his Twitter, his Patreon, his PayPal, and his Quebec series in the description, so you can go check him out, and if you like it just as much as I do, also support him in the future yourself. Many thanks to you for watching this video, many thanks to Ravignon for working with me on this, and many thanks to those of you who will check out his great channel and content, and possibly even support him. Thank you, and I hope to see you all soon again with another video.